The title of my talk is The Visibility Bind, Platform Labor, Precarity, and Resistance in the Creator Economy. Um, and as I mentioned, and I'm sure many of you are familiar, the past 2 weeks has been incredibly turbulent and volatile for social media, with profound implications for democracy. Meta, just a few days after noting that they were essentially deracinating its fact-checking partnerships in favor of this community notes content moderation, is poised to lay off 5% of its workforce. In the US, TikTok's future hangs in a very delicate balance. On Sunday, it is slated to go dark if an agreement is not made for its divest or ban date. And so there's a lot of discussions about how this could impact culture and society and the economy and politics. Given my research, I'm especially interested in thinking about how this is going to impact members of the creator economy. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And again, as I said, there's so much flux and volatility. And what I hope I can do with you today is provide a framework for making sense of this flux for the creators, who represent what my colleagues and I refer to as platform dependent laborers. And I'm happy to chat more about what that means. But essentially, though they are not full-time employees of the platforms on which they create content, their livelihoods are bound up with the platform economies, systems of governance, and infrastructures. So how do I get to this framework? What I want to do is foreground how much of it plays out through the ideal of visibility, and more specifically, the ideal of data-driven visibility that the platform economy is really built upon. And so in the next 35 minutes or so, I want to talk first about the promises of platform visibility, why people are compelled to participate in the creator economy. And then think about some of the risks and the perils. Again, we're seeing these play out in real time. And then to make sense of this through a concept that I'm calling the visibility bind. And then I will open this up for Q&A. I really want to hear your thoughts and engage with all of you. So that's where we'll go in the next few minutes. So what do I mean by visibility? I mean, it's a profoundly ambivalent concept, and it's certainly beyond the scope of this talk to think about all the ways in which visibility plays out in various platform and digital environments. I'm a media studies scholar, and so the ideals and the understandings I draw on often rely upon communication discourses. Two particular constructions of visibility get invoked in the rhetoric about platforms and the creator economy. The one is equating visibility with the politics of representation, right? And this has a long history in studies of the media and cultural and advertising industries. Early accounts of symbolic annihilation, for instance, use visibility to benchmark social progress or lack thereof. In more recent years, scholars have shifted from politics of visibility to what Sarah Benet-Weiser and others call economies of visibility, which foregrounds the dimension of presentation. Visibility becomes an end in itself rather than a means to an end. And I found this piece by Cesar Jimenez Martinez and Lee Edwards incredibly productive. If you're not familiar, I'm happy to send it around. So this article was from 2 years ago, and they helped to make sense of these nuanced ideas of visibility by arguing that the promotional regime of visibility coexists by casting visibility as a form of surveillance. It's also something that's seen as fragile and fleeting. But when we think about the politics of visibility, as I mentioned, visibility is an ultimate aim, right? If a particular group garners visibility, what does that mean? And so thinking about this framework, what if we swap out promotional regimes of visibility and think about the ways the platform economy encourages these forms simultaneously? And so if you're thinking about the platform economy, that often the discourse is focused on creators. And I've been studying this community in various forms for about a decade. The term is thrown around a lot. What do we mean by creators? It's a subsector of the cultural economy that we can see situated at the intersection of creative careers, culture, and technology. And I think one of the things that differentiates creators from their legacy counterparts, whether we're talking about journalists or TV writers, is the fact that they are, as I said before, platform dependent. They're independent workers who rely on social media platforms to create, distribute, and or market their social media persona. And that means that they are very much bound to the whims and the vagaries of social networks with whom they often have little direct contact. Um, and the term creator economy is thrown around and people picture Mr. Beast, but it's incredibly variable. Content creators span genres, span platforms. Monetization is staggeringly um, disparate. And so I'm essentially very much concerned with, or very much focused on, what we would think of as like the middle class of creators or ordinary people who see this as a career route. And I'll talk a little more about that. Um, there's these perhaps hyperbolic accounts of what the creator economy is slated to become. If you've followed this at all, you've heard these statistics from Goldman Sachs where the creator economy could swell to $500 billion by 2027. I mean, it's a staggering amount. I can't even imagine what these estimates are based on, but it's got a lot of attention, right? When you hear that much money is being poured into something, of course, it garners a lot of attention. There's been concerns about the more insidious elements where young people are being exploited in this. There's moral panics about, oh my God, kids want to be influencers. And there's assumptions that, to work in this space, it's for glib narcissists. So, when I think about this, there's a lot of different narratives that I encounter that in a lot of ways are disparaging and potentially damaging to the majority of people that work in this space. So I've spent the last decade studying social media and labor, and really the last 5 years focused in particular on creators across TikTok, Twitch, YouTube, and Instagram. I've done 2 published papers with my grad students or former grad students, and since then I've been working on a book where I've done 50 to 60 additional interviews with influencers, creators, marketers, as well as platform company reps, all really focused on the fraught meaning of visibility. And what I want to do is share some of the insight. I mean, perhaps not surprisingly, creators are compelled to put themselves out there. And there's this narrative that circulates quite vibrantly, both within the social media landscape, but more broadly about what it means to not just put yourself out there, but to embrace risk, to offload any concerns onto yourself. Because yes, there could be vulnerabilities of putting yourself out there, but it's seen as something where huge benefits could potentially befall you. And so what does putting yourself out there mean for creators? Well, certainly we hear this link to economic rewards, right? This is no longer seen as a leisure time passive activity of posting content, but instead it's something that promises economic rewards, so much so that supposedly an estimated tens of millions of people in North America are employed in this space. And so people talk about the perks of getting paid to post. In US dollars, this last figure is kind of helpful for getting a scale of how much people work in this space. Is just kind of an average benchmark of a middle class creator. Well, I was making $5,000 the first year, then $55,000 last year is $105,000. So we can see kind of at least some sense of what this looks like in a way that challenges, the fact that Mr. Beast is making $50 million a year. That is the exception, not the rule. Pervasive narrative is this idea of doing what you love. I've been interested in this narrative for quite some time. It's a familiar refrain, particularly in neoliberal cultures where, you find a job that is both personally rewarding, but also economically lucrative. And so these narratives have been around for quite some time. But what I think is really interesting is how many big tech companies are really peddling this myth of the American dream, where you get paid to do what you love. And so Meta, and I just checked this morning, this is still on there. They have their creator page, where they say, earn tools, earn money doing what you love. Snap has really been pushing to court creators. Um, X has been wooing individuals to join them. TikTok, of course, is anybody's guess what happens there. But what we're seeing here is these platform companies that started as social networking sites are kind of pivoting to the creator space because of course, this enables them to maintain their data-driven advertising economies for very little money. Um, Another key element when we're thinking about the visibility in the creator economy is the fact that number of these different companies have these smaller courses and programs that are benchmarked to support creators of color and other marginalized communities by offering them visibility. And so Kiwi was one of my interview participants, who was actually selected to appear on a billboard in New York's Times Square. And she said, Twitch selected me. They handpicked me for this Black Brilliance site. She said, you'll see your numbers go up. You'll see your discoverability rise. She said, because Twitch has put you in front of an audience. Otherwise, it's really, really difficult to just be seen. And so none of the kind of promises of visibility that I just mapped out are perhaps surprising to anyone who follows this space. I mean, of course, there's incentives to do this. People aren't cultural dupes who are, ignorantly posting. There are potential rewards. But what I think is really important to draw attention to are the risks and the perils of visibility, which often get elided in public discussions of this. And so I want to think about two, namely invisibility and hypervisibility. So what do I mean for invisibility? Because in some ways it seems strange to think about creators being invisible, given how supremely visible they are in popular culture. Well, there's a few ways that invisibility plays out within this space, and I'll talk about these and highlight some accounts from my interviews, namely the potential for economic devaluation, the volatility of the platform landscape, and threats that are often seen as forms of light censorship. So in looking at this space, something that I noted quite a few years ago has only become more pervasive, and that's what I call aspirational labor. Essentially, people posting away with the expectation that they become the next big thing, that they become the next superstar tiered creator. And fortunately, a lot of accounts have come out kind of taking down or critiquing the advertising economies that try to exploit young people. But I've heard from so many creators, even recently, that brands essentially expect them to do promotional work without paying them. Ella, you can see here, said, someone on Instagram is saying you get paid six figures and all you have to do this, but essentially they're accepting a bottle of sunscreen in exchange for 8 hours of work. Mira told me that she struggles to get paid from brands, let alone justified payment. And crucially, these systems of economic devaluation or exploitation are much starker for women, and especially women of color. And so we see these gender and race-based pay gaps play out in this space. There's a number of surveys that have come out. My creator interview participants mentioned this. Nina said, a lot of brands, they'll undersell creators, especially if you're a creator of color. She drew attention to this study that came out that creators of color get paid 30% less. We also see this play out within the gender space. And so there we think about invisibility as an economic threat, but we can also think about it as a more tangible material threat. And as I said, given what's going on in the US context with TikTok, we're really seeing this fear of a ban come into sharp relief. And this impacts creators acutely. Again, there will be fallout if the ban is realized for many people, but thinking about if your livelihood is dependent on this, how do you know if you're going to get paid for next week if you can't create your brand deal? And so I think it's really interesting for me, given all this ban discourse, to go back and look at my interviews. So from 2020, I've heard folks saying, okay, well, I actually formed a goodbye video because I thought the ban was going to be, or I thought the TikTok was going to be banned. And so we've been hearing about this for years. It's kind of a boy who cried wolf situation. In 2023, Mia told me I feel like my career can arbitrarily be taken away. It's dependent on the algorithm. It's dependent on US-China relations and Congress. She said just being a creator inherently exposes to risk. And I think this is important because the creative industries have always been a source of risk. Thinking about whether we're talking about music or journalism or advertising. I mean, there's an inherent sense of precarity there. Mark Dews has an article that just came out that locates this precarity in the late 19th and early 20th century. It's not new, but what is new is the fact that this is bound up with platform companies who there's no direct lifeline to. There's no way to get a hold of someone at TikTok if you're a creator, unless you're the top tier. And so um, there's that level of instability and precarity. But there's also the fact that unseen algorithms dictate so much of this, which I'll get to. One metaphor that came up and seems again eerily prescient now is the notion of borrowed land. If you create this portfolio of content on TikTok and it's banned, what happens to that? What does that mean for ownership? There's some interesting legal questions that are playing out. Another risk of invisibility is that your account gets banned. And some of you, if you use these platforms as an everyday user, you may have experiences with this, and it's frustrating, right? You're like, what, okay, I didn't actually break the rules or the content moderation guidelines, but I'm not seen. If your livelihood depends upon this becomes much more emotionally and financially taxing. And so I've heard so many accounts from creators who live with this sense of fear of, is my account going to be there? Am I going to be wrongfully punished? And so Carrie, who had an OnlyFans account and created an Instagram account with adult content to direct people there, said she followed the rules, but still she would wake up and she never knew if her account would be there. She said the losses were devastating, tearful, emotional, scary, because you're like, I've become invisible. And she's like, no one is going to argue that my 4 million people isn't incredibly valuable. I've also heard accounts from creators who talk about politicized, but really anything that is of importance to socially significance and politically progressive topics, fear that they are going to be shadow banned. Shadow banning is when your content is demoted or deprioritized without your knowledge. And there's a lot of debates whether this actually exists, which we can talk about in the Q&A. Nina said every time, she was a woman of color, and said every time I spoke about how TikTok's algorithm is different for people of color, I always get hit with a content violation, or the following videos will be shadow banned. And so thinking about the kind of implications for censorship there, what can I not say that, or what can I say that'll get me dinged, and how dinged by the algorithm, and how can I stave off that sort of criticism? And so, we have these risks of being invisible, of not being seen. But these run parallel to the risks of being hypervisible, being too seen. And so, what that means is, of course, different from individuals. But when I think about hypervisible, the question is hypervisible to whom? And a lot of this comes back to the audience. So I want to, in the next few minutes, talk through some of the risks of being excessively visible or being too visible, because there's a wide spectrum of offenses here. The first is burnout. And you may have come across this term platform fatigue, where you essentially are maintaining a cross-platform presence on 2, 3, 4 different platforms. As an academic, I think about that like LinkedIn and Blue Sky and whatever other platform of the moment. But if your livelihood is dependent upon that amps up the labor demands. And so I've heard from so many creators about the mental health strain, and it's been really it's kind of strange, because I've always said, like, I come at these issues as a sociologist rather than a psychologist, but inevitably interviewees continue to talk about kind of the psychological harms that befall them from having the need to churn out content, because the next could be the big win. So Mia, who I mentioned earlier, talked about being burnout on TikTok as a creator, performing for the algorithm, trying to condense everything into these 2 or 3 minute sound bites. She said it's a weird way to always be trying to go viral. David, not a creator, but a creator manager for a talent company, told me there's a lot of mental energy that goes on to it behind the scenes for creators. He said, and I think they get burned out. They have to think about it so often. And he said, he's a manager. He's like, I can go on vacation. He's like, they can't. You can't just like take a week off from producing content, because your followers may drop. So there's this fear of, again, being punished. And so that's where we see the conditions for burnout. So many of my interview participants, especially from marginalized communities, talked about the risks of hate and harassment, trolling, doxing. Not surprisingly, these were amplified for marginalized communities. And I think what was so concerning is how often this was normalized as part of the job. And so Nadia, a Twitch streamer, talked about having a thick skin. She said, being a Twitch streamer, I've learned to cope with the things I deal with. There were hate raids where people come into your stream and they raid you and copy and paste and use bots to attack you with nasty homophobic messages. Ashley told me that a lot of the fans are very toxic. And it's not just that there's this toxicity, but there's the fact that it seems to be incentivized by platform companies, right? Visibility begets additional visibility. And so it was really interesting to hear about the discussions, how creators dealing with this hate and harassment made sense of the role of platforms. And a lot of them felt that the platform companies hadn't mitigated the risk. So Heather talked about the filter mechanism, said, they didn't do a good job filtering out racist comments. You have to go through individually on your own. Nora said there's very little support. I've often reported comments, awful things that have happened to me and nothing. And so this is especially alarming when we think about the fact that, again, Meta is scrapping its system for this kind of open content moderation system and thinking about the potential risks, especially for those in society's margins. And it's not just that platforms don't protect them, as I said, there's this notion that they incentivize hate and harassment. And so I've heard about people saying that they got served on the wrong side of the algorithm. I'm creating content about the LGBTQ plus community, and it ends up on conservative TikTok. Kiwi, who I mentioned at the beginning, the Twitch streamer, said there's so much trolling and random people with no life. She said, in order to get rid of those, you risk getting rid of every follower you have. And so there's creators who are trying to purge the bots or get rid of the negativity, and they lose their followers. And I've interviewed others who say, yeah, hate is harmful, but it boosts my numbers, and so I keep it there. And so thinking about this kind of system where you get rewarded by these rage bait economies. Also something that we need to keep in mind when we're paying attention to hypervisibility is when you have so much content out there, and when people establish these parasocial relationships with you, what that means when we're thinking about being the targets of NCII, non-consensual image-based abuse. Deepfake porn is the term. And so Tristan, one of my interview participants, told me about, the trolls saying things that were unsafe, and saying they wanted to make deep fakes of her. And there's been a number of concerns, especially in the Twitch streaming community, given a scandal that erupted there. But again, what does this mean when your career compels you to be hyper visible and people are weaponizing these tools? And so to make sense of this, I've been thinking of it as a visibility bind, as this essentially precarious situation that creators find themselves in when they fear being seen as not visible enough, but alternatively as too visible, and how that relates to this visibility bind. And so, as I said, once I faced with this imminent threat of algorithmic content moderation or punitive shadow bans, creators are overwrought by the fear of not being seen, but they confront the pitfalls of hypervisibility too, which I just laid out, from surveillance and commercial appropriation to trolling and identity-based harassment. And what's a kind of key element of this is that the consequences and conditions are, of course, I don't know if of course, but importantly amplified for historically disadvantaged creator communities. And we can think about how this parallels situations in the workforce. As Buchanan writes, hypervisibility and invisibility are contrasts to visibility, but represent different manifestations of the same oppressive forces, namely subjugation and devaluation. And so, when I think about this, it's kind of a bleak view, but I want to shift and think about some of the ways in which creators are pushing back and using the same mechanisms of visibility to contest platforms' visibility regimes. And so we've seen in recent years a few ways in which the platform power, the dynamic between creators and platforms, it's not being upended, but it's being challenged and pushed back against. Astonishing array of creator practices, from participation in influencer engagement groups to these attempts to kind of flout content moderation by using terms that seemingly the algorithm won't pull back on, known as algo speak, have represent ways to contest platform power. Um, and so if you're not familiar with this term, algo speak was, I think, a media term given to the fact that creators, of course, are keenly aware of what is going to set the algorithm off and potentially get them blacklisted or punished. And so they come up with workarounds in hopes of thwarting the system. And so, and this was years ago by now, they probably don't still use this, but she said, nobody's going to use the word. If I use trans, my video is going to go under review. If I use sex, my video is going to go under review, but I use SEGGS because to kind of outsmart the algorithm, but my community is in the know. And this way I can still get my content across without triggering the algorithm. I heard this from someone else who said, I know there's certain words that is not going to get seen. And so I have these kind of clever strategies to use coded terms in order to ensure that I can still reach my community despite the kind of watchful eye of the platform companies. We've also seen a number of either boycotts or strikes where creators seem to weaponize invisibility. One was almost 4 years ago now. Creator Eric Lewis was seen as kind of the face of this movement, but where Black creators essentially used the hashtag Black Creator Strike to call attention to the fact that they were not getting due credit for their work. Twitch streamers have organized a boycott. I have no idea if this is going to happen, but I've seen people saying that on January 20th, which is the day after Trump takes office, that there could potentially be either a meta strike or boycott. And so we see these tools of visibility, and those, especially with high followers, are able to amplify this message and essentially call out platforms. And I think this is also important is with this notion of amplifying messages or signal boosting, where creators recognize the power they have to kind of steer the conversation in ways that draw attention to labor activism and highlight potential for change. And so to wrap up a bit here, the first takeaway is that platform companies are prodding all of us to join this workforce and kind of compelling us to be creators and put ourselves out there. And I think this is a really telling shift from courting us as social media users. That no longer puts enough money in their coffers. And so now the idea is, you too can become a creator. And I think to me, it's also telling that this is happening at the same time that these companies are laying off staffers en masse. And it reminds me of what happened with reality TV 20 years ago, where there was a strike, and so there was no source of labor for the TV industry, and so it kind of outsourced labor by relying on the unpaid workers known as reality TV castmates. This is being contested right now. And so at the same time that these companies are just laying off their staffers, they're kind of doubling down on the creator economy narrative. Again, you too can join us. And so this creates these conditions of visibility is seen as a promise. But if you are posting anything politicized, or even if not, and especially if you're a marginalized community, you're trapped within this so-called visibility bind, where you're constantly fearing being seen not enough, but at the same time being seen too much, or more explicitly being seen by the wrong audiences. But I do, as I said, I think I'm more optimistic actually than when I started this research, because I've seen how creators are smart and scrappy and entrepreneurial and have found ways to, in some ways, trap platform companies in a visibility bind of their own. And I guess my final closing thought is creators' experiences are some ways unique. This is a seemingly new career field, even though I drew attention to some of the important historical precursors and legacies, but none of this is unique. I was at at an event in December where I actually drew attention to a lot of the parallels I experience as an academic in this space, and I imagine many of you do. If you have any sort of if you post anything work related on social media, which now all of us are compelled to do because um, that's the kind of logic of university life today. And so thinking about how this visibility bind might resonate with your own experience or that of your students. And that's where I'll leave you. I look forward to questions and I thank you for your time and attention.